All right, so I'll start. Hi, this is Ming, and I just want to thank the organizers for the symposium and especially Shruit for all their work in organizing this panel. So I'm Ming, I'm a PhD student from York University, and I am presenting my paper on enslaved bodies, social reproduction, and transnational pipelines, rethinking gender-based violence in the Rohingya conflict. My presentation will start off with an overview of the context that grounds my research question. I then present my main thesis, the significance of my research project, and some some first few pathways of locating my findings and conclusions. Before I start this presentation, I want to preface that this presentation will mention topics of rape, sexual violence, and war violence. Grounding my research is the context of the escalation of the Rakhine State conflict, also known as the Rohingya conflict since 2012. Patterns of conflict-related sexual violence inflicted by the Tatmadaw military forces against Rohingya has reportedly followed a trend of gang rape, forced nudity, abduction, and sexual slavery. The 2018 United Nations fact-finding mission learns that women and girls were systematically abducted, detained, and raped in military and police compounds, often amounting to sexual slavery. Human Rights Council report that Tatmadaw soldiers abducted and deprived women of their liberty as forced laborers on military bases, and also report citing an open kidnapping of 20 girls from the Sitwe district at Rakhine State, taken away as sexual slaves into Tatmadaw military work camps. As the current Myanmar coup unfolds, patterns of sexual violence and conflict has since been blurred. And by engaging with these blurred lines of conflict and gender-based violence, it is key that then we can locate the pulses of violences on gendered communities. Understanding the assemblages of entrenched power between the spaces of conflict and peace, coups and non-coup period, and state and non-state induced violences, and therefore allowing us to open the possibilities of disrupting generative power relations. Briefly, sexual slavery is often defined, according to the UN, as an exercise of any or all of the powers attached to the right of ownership over one or more persons. But then this definition is narrowly defined and often criticized as not reflecting or not reflecting the lived experience of women and men coerced, manipulated, and threatened into enslavement. So institutions like United Nations and like other Western dominated institutions often put a victimizing gaze onto the phenomenon of gender-based violence in conflict, just to perhaps suit certain political actions that follows accordingly. So then it is more important then to document, listen, and write about the experiences of women and men subjected to sexual slavery in rethinking the assumptions of sexual slavery in conflict, reflecting not only the pulses of violence and the realities of it, but also to rethink and understand that conflict is not only a phenomenon that happens on the rural lands or this far away rural land, but rather it is current, unfolding, and globally constituted within and by global economies, not only as a phenomenon of the third world, but very much a product of the now. So my research question I asked, what causes the pervasiveness of sexual slavery in the Rohingya conflict? Specifically, what are the roles played by sex slaves within this conflict? What purpose does sexual slavery serve, and for whom? So entrenching the Rohingya conflict with the phenomenon of sexual violence within Myanmar's rapidly developing economy, which is broadly and intertwiningly connected to the developmental goals of the region, such as the Trans-ASEAN Pipeline, the ASEAN Power Grid, and ASEAN's integration into China's One Belt, One Road initiative. I argue that sexual slavery is co-produced through not only conflict, but also capital accumulative projects. Co-production in the sense that violence is produced through embedded practices, identities, institutions, and representations through multiple sites of norms and epistemologies, rather than through the victim perpetrator paradigms. Here I focus on sexual slavery surrounding the Sui gas pipeline and the Kalpu Special Economic Zone that is set up in the middle of conflict zones of the Rakhine State. I assert that women's bodies and their reproductive functions are key in reproducing a new generation of subordinated productive labor that continuously sustains the exploitative, hierarchicalized social and economic relationships between the Burma elites with their global corporate allies and against Myanmar's ethnic minority, and in this case, the Rohingya people. While this paper do not assert a causal relationship between sexual slavery and economic development, I seek to show a correlationality between the two and an attempt to address the intertwining relationships at the nexus of economic development, gendered violence, and conflict. So my paper has three main is significant in three ways. The first is the engagement with current literature exploring conflict-related gender violence, which frames gender-based violence, including sexual slavery, as a direct product of conflict. So usually we understand sexual slavery as explicitly a strategy of war, or indirectly a strategy of war to boost morals, socialization of troops, especially prominent in the case of the comfort women during the Japanese occupation, but also sexual violence as a means of genocide, a means of occupying the womb and signifying the death of the enemy population. And by understanding sexual slavery in conflict with at the nexus of development, this work engages that sexual slavery is not only the product of conflict, but also formed through current forces of the neoliberal economy. Second, I engage with conflict scholars that argues that economic development is key in securing peace. So with economic development, there will be jobs, education, and therefore higher stakes of conflict, to go to conflict. But by showing that there's a coexistence of development and conflict, I draw doubts that economic development will bring peace. Rather, I highlight that economic development, or the promises of economic development, has legitimized the use of violence in conflict. And also many have prized Southeast Asia as a peaceful region. Prominent scholars like Kishore Mahbubani and Jeffrey Singh often takes an essentialized and orientalist view on understanding development within the region. They kind of uses this some sort bring in and assume that there's this some sort of economic miracle that exists within the region, allowing for harmonious working together that will lead to stability of the region. Yet then it is important to ask who gets to see the region as peaceful and who does not see the region as peaceful, when in reality, Southeast Asia holds the longest civil war in Myanmar and also the most number of civil wars globally. So my work also kind of challenged the notions of popularized terms like ASEAN economic integration, ASEAN economic community, in understanding that this integration and this community more so represents the alliances of elites and global corporations rather than the actual improvement of living standards of people living and enduring the changes of the region. So development at the nexus of conflict. So my project focuses on, for this paper, focuses on two main development projects in the Rakhine State, the Sui Gas project and the Kalpu Special Economic Zone. So very briefly, the Sui Gas project was signed in 2000 by Daewoo International Corporations, which later bring in a consortium of 3 other stakeholders that are state-owned companies from Korea and India. The Sui Gas project is expected to bring the Burmese government a revenue of 1.8 billion and a total of 54 billion by 2032, making it the largest foreign exchange asset held by the Burmese government. The Kyaukphyu Special Economic Zone, or the KP Special Economic Zone, locates right next to the Sui Gas facility. It is signed by Singapore-based consortium with companies and corporations that include Ernst & Young, PJ Consultants, and the Global Maritime and Port Services. And they are based in Singapore. And this KP Special Economic Zone is estimated to bring in 15 billion in tax revenue in its first 50 years of operations into the Burmese economy. And the location of these developmental projects are located at the epicenter of the Rakhine State conflict along the Spiti district, which is the capital of the Rakhine State, the Butidong, Maodong, and Ratidong township that cuts through Rakhine. So testimonies of survivors has showed that developmental projects are where violence of sexual slavery unfolds and takes place. In 2018, a survivor noted by the UN fact-finding mission testified that around 20 to 30 women were taken from the Kautau township to the KP Special Economic Zone into the military camps. She was forced to work at military camps doing domestic chores, and where she was also taken into a room and raped by one soldier while the two others stood outside the closed doors. The survivor recounts that while the Tatmadaw was raiding her house, they exclaimed that there are jobs women need to do, as they take the women into military camps. In 2016, local officials have also stopped registering new Rohingya babies into official birth registries. The Arakan project estimates that more than 40,000 Rohingya children are not registered in formal registry and have been used as undocumented free labor within developmental projects. The Associated Press reports or has testimonies that hold that children are forced to work from 8 a.m. until dusk, scooping up river rocks and briskly carrying them up a hill. Rohingya children born from Rohingya women were held in captivity and essentially used as undocumented forced labor for the military. Yeah, I will quickly wrap up soon. So here I present a few preliminary pathways to locating the system, kind of the ways that I will look into seeing how, So I'm going to look into perhaps two main pathways in locating anxieties that systematically legitimize the capture and enslavement of Rohingya bodies as tools of capital accumulative projects. First is the procurement of slave labor is legitimized and tolerated by labor laws, regulations, designed and maintained for supporting wealth accumulation projects. Sexual slavery often cannot be traced directly through commands. There's no direct commands that we can locate. But then again, it can be implicitly embedded in laws, policies, and regulations. A close reading of the labor clause surrounding special economic zones of the law of Myanmar finds that power to negotiate, regulate, and determine labor rights are especially in the hands of the Tatmadaw appointed township superintendent. The law writes that non-resident foreigners has no business incorporated in the Union of Myanmar. And where Rohingyas are not considered citizens of Myanmar, the use of their labor is not regulated or accounted for. And second, I will look into the everyday context of gendered and racialized discriminations against Rohingya people that supports the embeddedness of discrimination or the procurement of slave-like labor within laws and regulations. Because Rohingya women were portrayed as prostitutes or loose women, in quotations, normalizing Rohingya women as sexualized beings. While Rohingya men are forced into slave manual labor, the normalization and marginalization of feminized servitude of the Rohingya women subject them to adoption, the normalization and the legitimization of adoption of the Rohingya body. Bourdieu writes that the social use of language own their specific social value to the fact that they tend to organize systems of differences which reproduce the classified and the classifying, the ranked and the ranking. That is, language and its codified meanings uttered in different ways reinforces social practices power system that rewards the dominant class while devaluating those in lower or working classes. So practices of social reproduction are pushed through dominant policies, discourses, and everyday practices of governance that will provide a very insightful genealogical platform in studying sexual slavery as a form of social reproduction practice within the economic development of Myanmar. Transnational, in conclusion, transnational pipelines, the logics of the development is a global phenomenon. From pipelines here in Canada to pipelines in Southeast Asia, and from the missing indigenous women to the Rohingya women who were taken from their lands and lands taken from them, economic and extractive corridors are active sites of locating power relations within the global capitalist economy as living, breathing sites that implicates gendered communities globally. So I will end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation, especially the connection of sexual violence and genocide and relating it to the land we are on is very, very brilliant and emphatic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. The next presentation is by Hari Casey from Balsillie School of International Affairs, Wilfred Laurier University. Please go ahead, Hari.
Okay, sorry for the trouble with my slides. So do you see the slides? Hello?
Yeah, we do.
Oh, okay.
Hey, we're good. We can see you. Oh. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Hari Casey. I am a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, Wilfred Laurier University. And I thank the organizer for the opportunity to present my paper today. So the paper I'm presenting today is a portion of my PhD dissertation. And I have titled it as The Entangled Precarities and the Nepali women migrant domestic workers in the Arabian Gulf countries. So let me begin with sharing some information about the destination countries where a number of Nepali women migrate for domestic work. So as you can see in the figure, the majority of Nepali women migrant domestic workers, they go to the Gulf countries to work as domestic workers, where they are popularly known as the khadamas. In the government statistics, however, there is, they don't really reflect. They are really absent very small percentage of the total migrant population. They occupy a very small portion, but indeed there are really a huge number of Nepali women migrants in the Gulf countries. And I will talk about why it is so in a bit later. So let me briefly mention the theoretical framework that I have employed in my research. So my research is, broadly speaking, informed by feminist epistemologies. And I look at particularly at three phenomena. I mean, three issues: globalization, the state, and a governance. But since feminist epistemology is not homogeneous epistemology, there is heterogeneity. So I really combine these two theoretical concepts from third world feminist theories and transnational feminist theories. But I also say that there is a need for decolonizing these theories when we really apply them and look into the shoes of women migrant domestic workers in the Gulf countries. So a bit about methodologies. About my methodology, I used multi-sited, I call it multi-sited global ethnographies, because I conducted my fieldwork in Nepal, and then in Qatar, and Kuwait, and then the United Arab Emirates. And I interviewed and collected data through observations and focus groups and interviews and other archival sources. So coming back to, linking back to why there is such a huge underrepresentation in the government state data of Nepali women migrant domestic workers in the Gulf countries, is that Nepal, since 1985, that was the time when Nepal imposed bans, complete bans on women migrating to the Gulf for domestic work. And the bans have taken different forms. It has appeared and reappeared in many forms and manifestations over a long period of time. It has continued to, the state has continued to impose bans and restrictions on women migrating to the Gulf for domestic work. And to this day, women are legally restricted, prohibited from migrating to the Gulf countries for domestic work. So the state, the government says that it is not only targeted only for women, it is also for men. If men want to migrate to the Gulf countries for domestic work, then they are also prohibited. So there is no gender discrimination, but it is gender discriminatory, especially because majority of women there are domestic workers. When I talk about the conceptual framework I have employed is here, in my research, is what I call local global entanglement, but I will come to that a bit later. But to talk about the transnational labor migration of women in Nepal, based on my ethnographies, I look at it in the context of the four pronged processes, especially in the context of neoliberal globalization. The local, indigenous, national, local oppressive, gender oppressive systems. But these systems are not only based on identities. They are also, these oppressive systems are also social, cultural, economic, and political gender oppressive systems. And at the same time, because of globalization, and especially neoliberal globalization that Nepal has been a very staunch adherent, especially following the 1990s, because before the 1990s, Nepal was, in fact, a very closed society. But in the 1990s, Nepal, after the political change, Nepal became a democratic, multi-party democratic system, adopted multi-party democratic system. Government adopted the structural adjustment programs, and the process of neoliberalization really expedited. And it has really intersected and interacted with the local gender oppressive systems in very complex and intricate ways, producing two what I call imaginaries. And that two imaginaries, I look at it in two ways. The first is what I call neoliberal imaginaries. What I mean by that is the consumerist values, the capitalist values that the global capitalism, neoliberal capitalism has really implanted into the consciousness of the people at large, but women in particular, because they have always produced gender outcomes. And the other is what I call imaginary, aspirational imaginaries. Aspirational, what I mean by that is, at the same time, neoliberal globalization has produced dreams and desires and aspirations in the people, including women. And these dreams and aspirations are the dreams to be independent, to have freedom, and the other component is the transnational connection and circuits and the geopolitical situation, Nepal's geopolitical situation. This is also very important because of the bans and restrictions, many women, they travel to the Gulf countries through India, different Indian cities, using other third countries. From India, some women, they revealed they were taken to Colombo in Sri Lanka, and from Sri Lanka to the destination countries. So therefore, the geopolitical location is also important, because Nepal and India, they share the international border between these two countries is open because of the friendship treaty, peace and friendship treaty of 1950. So this is the broader context in which the transnational labor migration of women, especially for domestic work, has taken place in Nepal. So to look at, to zoom in the lived experiences of women, even in the rural spaces and a newly urbanizing town spaces in Nepal, we can see a very, the global local entanglements in very complex ways, producing gender outcomes. The figure shows the local gender oppressive systems based on economic, political discriminations and inequities, and also the identity-based discriminations based on Dalit untouchability, so-called Dalit, because of caste hierarchy, especially women are even doubly, triply oppressed. And also these, it's very difficult to disentangle. I mean, because the way when they really interact and intersect with each other, they produce spatially two important phenomena, what I call the feminization of poverty and a responsibleization of livelihood. They are not only poor, they're also responsible to provide for their family. Because to look at it in the context of a collective culture, collectivist culture. What I really mean by the entangled precarities is the precarities, the lived precarities of these women are produced in multiple sites, at multiple scales, family to society to national to interstatal, transnational to global, in all the origin countries, origin country, transit and destination countries. And these precarities, these precarities are produced by the entanglements of the gendered systems. So I really wanted to contribute to the discussions on precarity. Some have called it soft violence, precarity chains, protracted precarity. Parenas and Silve and others have looked at it that way, but I look at it and I argue that these are entangled precarities. So, okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hari. That was a brilliant presentation. I learned a lot about the precarious aspects and the peculiarities of like migrant workers who are women from different countries, that go to other countries for domestic work. Thank you so much. Our next presentation is by Harshita Yalamarty from York University. Harshita, please go ahead. I think you're on mute, Harshita.
My apologies. Are folks able to see my slides?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, and thank you everyone who's here. My name is Harshita Yalamarty. I'm a PhD candidate in the Gender, Feminist and Women's Studies Department here at York. I'm grateful to the current treaty holders of this land, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, to be able to live and work upon this land as a recent settler, student, teacher, and researcher. So my presentation today is titled, You Have to Learn to be Independent, Gender, Class, Caste, and Transnational Meanings of Domestic Work. And the presentation is drawing from a chapter in my doctoral dissertation, and my larger dissertation focuses on the transnational experiences and decision-making processes of Indian marriage migrant women in Canada. Firstly, looking at how women deal with changing educational and labor expectations, both public and private. And secondly, understanding how women access community support and networks in the diaspora, including caste networks. Excuse me. Yeah. So to tell you a little bit more about the theoretical and methodological grounding for my project, I conducted qualitative in-depth life history interviews with 24 marriage migrant women in the GTA who had come from India. I conducted these interviews in 2019. So among my respondents, a majority were are Hindu. They are over 30 years old, and they had arrived in Canada within the last 10 years. More than half of my respondents had led the migration process as permanent residency applicants or as international students. And a majority of them were also highly educated and belonged to the middle class in India. So the class aspect of my sample was not a surprise because, as some of us might be aware, The Canadian permanent residency application system relies on a points system, and the points system, to qualify with an appropriate number of points, there's a high threshold of educational experience, educational qualifications and work experience, as well as language proficiency, and you have to show a substantial financial investment as well. So with all these taken into account, my sample was accordingly belonged to the middle class in India. So I also take a transnational and intersectional lens to analyze my respondents' narratives. The idea being here that understanding gender as constructed in contextual power hierarchies, but also trying to hold these contexts in simultaneity across two different sites in India and in Canada. So in fact, so I'm going to talk only about domestic work today. I'm not even going to touch upon childcare in the lives of my respondents. But this aspect of domestic work is part of the larger chapter that explores marriage migrant women's lives in Canada, which they characterize as sort of either as independence or as isolation within their homes, within their workplaces, and in their community networks as well. Now, domestic work, I understand it as part of social reproductive activities that enable household members' participation in waged work and public activities. As we just heard from Hari, sometimes domestic work is outsourced to paid domestic workers. And there is obviously a big transnational movement of domestic workers from the third world, the so-called third world, to the countries like Canada, for instance. But, and so to take you back to India a little bit, one of the ways in which middle class status has been understood in India, in one of the symbols of middle class status in India is the ability to hire paid domestic workers, primarily female domestic workers, to outsource domestic work to them, basically. And it's understood as, like I said, a symbol of middle class status. Scholars have also argued that for middle class women in India to be able to enter waged work, to be able to enter into the public sphere, this is reliant on outsourcing that labor to domestic workers. And so middle class women and working class women are in that kind of a relationship where middle class women's participation is based on that relationship to working class women. But of course, the story changes when there is migration. So one of the things that would come up a lot in my interviews is that women experience the change most acutely in terms of the lack of paid domestic workers and having to do all of the domestic work themselves. So the discussions on domestic work would usually fall under two broad comparisons. Firstly, the amount of housework in India as opposed to Canada that the women themselves did, as well as the gender division of housework between my respondents and their husbands. So on the one hand, women bemoaned that they lost the comfort that a paid domestic worker brought to them. But at the same time, most of them really appreciated that their husbands were stepping up and doing work, whereas the actual comparison was that the husbands were doing a lot more domestic work in Canada as opposed to the amount of work they did in India. The rest of the presentation, I'm just going to take you through one or two stories from my respondents, and I'm going to try and unpack gender, class, and caste in these narratives. So Anupriya was one of my respondents who came to Canada as an international student. At the time I interviewed her, she was a student, but also she was working part-time as a physiotherapy assistant. So she had come as an international student and her husband had joined her on an open work permit. He spent a few months looking for jobs and finally he did manage to find a full-time job in his field. But at the same time, she found that, having come from a household where she did not have to do as much domestic work, she didn't even know how to cook before she got married. She found that the amount of housework was really sort of weighing on her. And she was very frustrated that her husband was not stepping up and helping. She also had an arranged marriage. So this is an aspect that I explore more in my chapter, where the decision to marry was left up to her parents. So she, as you see in the quote, she kind of blames her parents too. So she says, for instance, my parents didn't send me all this way to scrub endless dishes. I've had to train my husband to take care of domestic chores. So not only is she sort of thinking about the gendered imbalance here, but she's also expressing a downward class mobility that she's experiencing. So the loss of paid domestic workers is putting her in a position where she feels herself to be downwardly class mobile. And obviously this is at odds with the reason behind migrating, which is for upward social mobility and better opportunities, better economic status, and so on. So within this frustration, she also was, the fear for her future in Canada was also woven into this frustration. So she goes on to say, quote, "The only thing he can cook is instant ramen noodles. What if I leave for my job in the future and that's all he can feed the kids? That's not acceptable." So for her, her frustrations and her fears are woven in with the fact that when she does, and she expects to work in the public sphere, go out and work for work jobs, but at the same time, she can't rely on her husband as in the way he is right now to take care of the children. And she worries about what impact that will have on her ability to step out and have paid work. So in this particular case, so that was one of the challenges that she was facing in her marriage. And a few months before the pandemic, her mother-in-law came to visit and stay with them for a few weeks. And Anupriya had expected that this means she will have some support in the domestic sphere, and that there will be a little bit more freedom for her to keep looking for jobs and such, and more time for her to study. And then the pandemic struck, so she wasn't able to get a job anymore, and they were all cooped up inside her apartment. And what she actually found was that all of her training that she had offered her husband up till this point all sort of fell away, because her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, was the one who was sort of enforcing gender norms once again in the house and saying, well, the husband, like my son, shouldn't have to do cleaning and cooking, I'll do that instead. And so this was adding to Anupriya's challenges and frustrations inside the home. Another such person, another respondent who was in a similar position as Anupriya, she came as an international student. She was, as she was studying and working as a part-time grocery clerk, was Jasmine. So Jasmine, her husband had recently arrived from India when I met her. And she and her husband were living in a basement apartment, and they were sharing the basement apartment with another married couple. So she was sort of, she'd been in Canada for a few months already, and then her husband joined her. And of course, as soon as her husband joined her, the quantum of housework she needed to do went up substantially. And she explained to me, her husband was, came from a very well-off family in Punjab, and that he was the youngest son, so he was never expected to help out or have any responsibilities around the house anyway. So he wasn't doing what she needed him to do, especially as she was studying and working as well. So she told me, quote, when his mother calls up, she tells him to help me out because I'm out of the house so much. It's so nice. I didn't expect a mother-in-law would be like that. But my husband still says to me, did I get married only to do all these chores? And I say, well, you're not in India anymore. So in this way, she's trying to negotiate gendered imbalance in the domestic work with her husbands. But what she ended up doing in order to not fall behind on her chores was that she actually ended up negotiating shared responsibilities with the other wife with whom they shared the basement apartment. So Jasmine and the other wife would cook together in bulk. They would go grocery shopping together. They would do laundry on the weekends together. And they had reached a settlement where basically when one of the wives was out of the house, the other one would be responsible for reheating food and serving lunch and dinner to the men. So instead of addressing the gendered imbalance in the house, they just reached an alternative arrangement amongst themselves. I'll quickly conclude in the next couple of minutes. So as opposed to Anupriya, who had a future in Canada in mind, Jasmine was more ambivalent. She was struggling a lot. Her husband was very homesick. They kept thinking, we had it so good in India. We had these joint families. We were never lonely. We had domestic workers who did everything. Why are we struggling so much in Canada? So they talked often about wanting to go back. And one of the ways in which she expressed her frustration was in terms of caste. So one of the things she said was, and I'm going to say a name of a caste, which is also considered a casteist slur. She said, I have not come here to work like a bhangi. Now, the word bhangi here is a name for the Valmiki caste, which is a Dalit group, which were previously classified as untouchable for their association with cleaning household refuse and human waste, basically. And so Jasmine's association of this word, usage of this word signifies her unthinking association of household chores or menial chores, as she considered menial, with being lower caste. So it demonstrates two things. One is that because of the ways in which caste and dignity of labor are so closely intertwined in the society of India, those associations don't automatically fall away when Indian communities come and migrate to the diaspora. So, one of my arguments is that caste needs to be taken into account in the intersectionality of understanding gender and power relations within Indian communities in the diaspora. But the other thing I want to point out here is that not only is the lack of domestic workers seen as a downward class mobility, but as Jasmine demonstrates, there's also a way in which the self, or the dominant caste self, is perceiving itself as losing caste status for having to do all of these so-called polluting tasks on their own. And Jasmine wasn't alone in this. Like, a lot of diasporic members would say things like, oh, it was so surprising that in Canada I had to clean my own bathroom, or I had to clean my own dishes, especially at the workplace. So, and there are ways, so these are ways in which caste and labor are woven into understandings of, dignity and work, especially associated with domestic work amongst members of the Indian community in diaspora. So in conclusion, these are the ways in which gender, class, and caste are woven into transnational meanings of domestic work. And with that, thank you to my respondents, thank you to the symposium organizers, and thank you to members of the writing group who are in the audience and in the panel today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Harshita. It was a brilliant presentation. I especially learned how I can probably look at domestic work as a subset of, the broader care work, and there would be different set of nuances that would come to light. So that was very interesting for me. Thank you so much for this. Our last presentation for today is by Sofia Ahmed from York University. Sofia, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Go ahead, take care.
Yes, I'm ready. Sorry, one second. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, please, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So hi everyone, my name is Sofia. Thank you so much for having me. I am a PhD first year gender feminist and women's studies student at York University. Just like I would like to acknowledge that all the presentation were amazing, and definitely I learned a lot as well. Before I talk about my own presentation, I would just like to say that, as we know that it's already, established that, gender, like by other presenters that, and my other wonderful colleagues, that gender, race, and that religious discrimination do exist, not only in Rohingya or Nepal or India, like domestic and private sphere conflicts, but it happens in US and Canada as well. So like my personal background and life experiences contributed to the research interest that I am doing right now, because I was an immigrant woman from a racialized community, and I encountered a number of barriers when seeking employment opportunity when I came to Canada. Sadly, these barriers were not a unique experience for me, because there are many other women who were suffering the same difficulties. And these practices really disadvantage women in general. So like say, before we do anything, this slide is for the end. If someone wants to ask a question or wanted to answer this question, if how many of you work side by side with a colleague who wears a hijab? Why I ask these questions is just because it will give you an idea that how the work employment that world have discrimination towards Muslim women who wear hijab, and also like how many hijabis are working with you. So I just wanted to go through the numbers. I did establish a meta-analysis. So this is going to be the presentation. It's going to be more like numbers and stuff, but I would like to speak to those numbers. So there are over 1 million Muslim in Canada, that's by Stat Canada, and 42% reported experiencing discrimination in the past 5 years. So the meta-analysis that already published is telling us simply that 40% likely that women, like without hijab will hired than women with hijab, even though they have Muslim names. So this is my presentation. There will be some background hypothesis, and just go by the gender, sex, religion, race, and hijab intersect together. Muslim women can be in triple to quadruple jeopardy of experiencing discrimination in employment and in other important structure of society. There are many things that I can't put in on everything in the slide, but I will just only focus today on the employment. So just giving you more numbers, Muslims made up to 2% of the USA population in 2011, but filed 25% of the religious discrimination complaint that year. It doesn't mean that it does not exist. They just didn't do it because maybe it's not, they never been heard. So many cases, the reported cases involved Muslim women who wore the hijab, were denied employment or discharged by their employers, that especially in the restaurant, facility, they said like, it's just like make our quote unquote, make our clients really uncomfortable. So like how discrimination in Canada, I will say about the Quebec ban public employees from covering their faces, reducing employment opportunities for women who wear hijab. There are many stereotypes. People ask like random questions to Muslim women. How would you breathe? How would you do that? How can you? And honestly, the question I'm gonna ask is like, with the mask and everything, how would you breathe, right? So when you have to breathe, you will breathe. So there are like some narratives. There's like about it's about with the studies. I didn't do any qualitative studies, it's all quantitative. So there are like numbers there. 11 of 20 people in charge of hiring educators and healthcare workers expressed fears of Muslims and associated the hijab with Islamic fundamentalism and being un-American. So as I said, that it is important to note that many highly educated and professionally credentialed Muslims, newcomers, are forced to take the jobs in unrelated fields with salaries far below their qualification. It's not I am saying, it's Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Center 2018 saying this not only creates economic issues of individuals, but for the nation as well. Given the Bank of Canada 2018 has reported labor shortages for decades, especially in skilled labor market and professional fields, research is needed to identify any discriminatory practices that prevent Muslim Canadians from fully participating in solving in Canada's labor shortage. It's for all it's for not only for only Muslims, it's for all Canadians, because some of them we will see, like all these immigrants come to Canada. You don't know your cab driver is a doctor, you don't know. So thus to understand this phenomena, it's critical to get insights from the women who are impacted by the phenomena the most. This is also vital to developing an understanding of how population perceives the barriers that encounter. They feel the feeling they experience, and the what strategy can be used to reduce those barriers. There are more numbers that 3 employers of 7 hired Muslims. Sorry, one second, it's on my screen. Sorry. So I'm sorry, 3 employers of 7 hired Muslim women without hijab described their fears in largely anti-Muslim workplace. Same like that, similarly selected hijabis described their consistent experience of discrimination in employment, academia, and travel. Another narrative, 20 hijab-wearing Muslim women executive supervisors and managers told stories about much greater workplace challenges than those of their colleagues who chose more Western or mainstream appearance, like same Muslim people, but one with hijab and one without hijab. So I have a hypothesis that Muslim women who wear the hijab are disadvantaged in employment process relative to their counterpart who do not wear hijab, just like their husbands. So they don't have to wear any kind of garb or any kind of like an identifier that they can be known in a society that they are Muslim. It's only the Muslim women who have to do it. So the Muslim women come with their husbands exactly like people we already established that they come to Canada looking for more like a good stable life and safer life and future, but limited opportunities compel them to accept temporary positions and service low services industry jobs such as cab drivers, wait staff. So what happened with this whole thing is unemployment and underemployment can result in poverty, which often results in mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. As a result of underemployment and unemployment, many Muslim immigrants must rely on programs such as Ontario Work and other social services. So what happened after that is they are stereotyped as being a burden on society. These kind of stressor contribute to a variety of sorry. For example, Muslim women who are often members of racialized and cultural minority group encounter a sort of a lot of other problems that their counterpart they don't. So there are some findings. This is the database I used to research my presentation and my papers. There are some numbers. I don't know if someone's interested to get those numbers, because there are many other number, the meta-analysis number. I know it's not I just put it there, if someone's interested in math and stat and that kind of stuff. So there are some findings. So my findings, sorry, oh, what happened? So my finding indicates that Muslim women with hijabs are disadvantaged in hiring process than Muslim women without the hijab. So these studies were being taken from 2010 and 2019 in the US, and was US studies for 4 and Germany 3. So more numbers, if anyone interested, more numbers. I can provide those numbers, and I can send it in the chat if anyone likes to know the numbers and stuff. This is the finding, like the whole paper finding. So now I wanted to talk about a little bit of this, implication, and I wanted to conclude my presentation. So according to my knowledge, this is the one I was talking about, like the meta-analysis I did is the first synthetic study to specifically examine the influence of wearing the hijab among Muslim women seeking the employment. So there are many things that these women face, but these are the main ones that I would like to have your attention towards. Like economic dependency on their spouses make them vulnerable to IPV, because if their husbands are only the breadwinner and they're the only one who's going out, and Muslim women are not getting job, and just because society don't want to give them job and stuff like that. So what's gonna end up in, it's gonna be intimate partner violence, because they're very dependent. Economic abuse, sexual and physical abuse, they will feel anxiety, they will feel depression, they will feel PTSD. And so now as a society, when we talk about practice and policy and implications and all that, our social workers and mental health professionals who try to help Muslim women, they have a different assumptions. They will assume that hijab makes them very oppressed, very vulnerable. It is, and they will say, like, because they chose to have a hijab and they chose to have this kind of life, so that may be the reason of male dominance in their life. But the reality is not that. The reality is, and I'm not saying that it's just my feeling, I'm just giving you reality about the cross-validating qualitative and quantitative studies of Muslim women in the contemporary West reported that many Muslim women feel very empowered in wearing the hijab, because the practice they want to do, the practice they want to, they feel very empowered. It may even provide them with some measure of protection against depression. When you're suffering with the depression, like what happened is, main thing is, like, whoever's facing that kind of depression, they just wanted to just like veil themselves. They just wanna to just go away. They just want to be vanished. So you never know what's going on in their life, but the assumption is there. So my suggestion is that Muslim feminist and Muslim Muslim feminist framework is crucial for Muslim clients. And this is the limitation I found. And I said, like, there are definitely more study needed in order to make my argument, because there are couldn't find any study in Canada that talk about this discrimination. And in my conclusion, millions of Muslims, women in the West likely experienced such employment discrimination over the past generation and will suffer over the next generation if policy status quo are retained and do not examine the relative risks or protections of diverse national, regional, and local policies. This is the, any question, anything, please do not hesitate to ask. Thank you so much.